Hey, kia ora, everybody. Welcome to the Dock Edge School screening of Unfit. I'm Matthew Donaldson, the Dock Edge Schools manager. This is Alicia Adair, the Dock Edge Schools coordinator. And we're very happy to have you here joining us for the introduction, but also the Q&A afterwards. I don't think anybody needs to see my fridge, Alicia. We are very grateful to the Ray Foundation for making this whole Dock Edge Schools program possible. And we're also grateful to everyone at Dock Edge who's worked so hard to transition this film festival from theatres to online. Um, Unfit is a movie of the times, really. There's so much stuff happening in the States. There's COVID, Black Lives Matter, and just the general sense that perhaps Trump isn't the right person to lead this country in this particular time. But that's all up for debate, and that's what democracy is about. But you'll be able to see that there are some elements which don't necessarily lean towards the idea that Trump, electability is based on democracy. However, we are going to get into a discussion about all of that post film screening. What have we got in the chat here? Have we got someone in the chat? No, that's Alicia posting. If you have any technical troubles, you can reach either of us there on our email addresses. And if you can stay with us here on this webinar jam link, we're going to close the mics and close the cameras and come back afterwards once once the film has screened, and we'll be back with Danny Osborne, who is a political psychologist, to discuss the ins and outs of the movies as well as some of the broader issues around the Trump presidency. So yes, please tune in, please join us. We would love to have you back. Alicia, what are your initial thoughts on this movie? It was new, interesting, new at all?
Not really new, but definitely interesting because I think we've all had our thoughts, you know. And so it's good to have a bunch of psychologists, psychiatrists speak to what they believe Trump is like, and comparing him to some of the biggest dictators the world has ever seen is it's not a shock, but it is. So yeah, it's good to learn, the languaging around what the psychologists, etc., believe and why they believe that. Yeah.
Certainly, and even though this documentary is very easy to take at a political level, the actual psychological state of Trump is really what's in question here and is the subject of the documentary. So, yes, let's get into it. You don't want to hear us talk about it all day. You'll have plenty of time for that after the movie. So, Alicia has posted in the chat schools.dockedge.nz film Unfit. If you give that a click right now, hover your cursor over play now, and when I say go, we will push play together, and then we'll come back afterwards for the question and answer session. So, hovering over play now, 3, 2, 1, go, and you just push play again on that main film page. We'll see you back for question and answer afterwards. What did you think of that, Alicia?
Yeah, I thought it was really, for this time around, because I watched it a few times, I found it really interesting, the journey that, what's his name? The guy who was like, no, Donald Trump isn't racist. But then going to be like, he's horrible.
Yeah, this is how his
Pretty
behaviours
much.
affected me.
Yeah, pretty much. And so I found it really interesting, his story this time around. And that'll be so gutting, backing someone that much and then realizing that they're causing harm. So yeah, I found that in particular, that really stood out to me this time. And Dr. Danny will hopefully be joining us soon.
yeah, I'm
But
I'm
he does
aware
have
that
a daughter that he needs to pick up from school a bit early today.
yeah, and that's fine. And I'm also aware that the film file supplied to us is 15 minutes shorter than was originally advertised. So I'm happy just to talk with you a little bit more here about your perspectives on this, Alicia, if that works for you.
Yeah.
I was interested by the assertion that this is part of a natural scheme of things where lots of external factors threaten a society because it's gotten too big to manage internally properly, and then there's a strong person who offers hope and salvation and force, and we'll take care of the bad people who are threatening us, even though they don't actually have those answers. But people want
Mm.
to want people want a leader to take care of their problems for them rather than addressing problems themselves, and then that creates more external conflict. What do you think about that idea that it's genetically pre-programmed into us? The cavemen in the valley and the sheep, stealing a sheep, and you've got to kill the other tribe because they took the sheep, and that kind of thing. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's just another view on justice, you know. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends how the community does things. Like I know in Samoa, um, there's this thing where if somebody harms somebody from another family, one way of like transformative justice, um, is that a word for it?
I think so. Yeah.
Um, one of the things that they do is that they'll kneel in front of the person's house until the person who was harmed forgives them, and so yeah, I guess it's just if that's the community, if that's their
How
way of getting justice, then yeah.
how is that enforced? Is there like a judiciary within the tribe that passes a judgment that they have to stand outside the person or kneel outside the person's house, or is it like a
Yeah, so
wet
there's
wet?
um there's chief and or matai, and they also have orators. So there's basically like a board or a council, and so from what I know, the orators from each side will hear each side's story, and then the orators will come together and discuss, and then yeah, whatever they decide to do is what happens. Um, but it's not like a chuck 'em in prison kind of thing, or yes, it's not like cancel culture. It's more like what does the victim want? And that's actually happens a lot of communities. Like I know that in the States, there's the Chicago Black Drag Council. So drag artists, um, they'll have a meeting if something's happened in the community, and then the person that it happened to will be able to say like, this is what I want from this. Like I watched one recently where the person who had caused harm was an organizer of events, and so they asked him to step down and hand over his power to somebody else who can organize events, and so that happened. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion. Welcome, Danny. This is Dr. Danny Osborne from University of Auckland, who is an expert on political psychology. We were just talking about restorative justice and community justice rather than the top down throw them in prison and away they go. And looking at there was some commentary within the film about this is the natural way of things, and it's not just um, a Trump problem, but it's emblematic of uh, whenever there's some perceived injustice that a strong leader who may not have the answers but says that they have the answers, um, and, or even generates a phantom menace. generates this fear for the tribe that allows them to get in behind unquestioningly the truth of this strong leader and supports them whether they're worthy of support or not.
Yeah, and kind of building off of that, one of the crazy things about this phantom menace that winds up being created, there's some research out there suggesting that populist movements like the Trump movement and like some of the things that are going on in Poland at the moment, Hungary, these various countries in Europe that are finding increased support for populist leaders, they seem to have originated during relatively prosperous economic times, which in some ways really conflicts with a lot of our intuitions about, working class people being afraid for their jobs and for the economy. It doesn't seem to necessarily be that way in reality. It's almost like these populist leaders are able to almost capture like lightning in a jar and turn people's opinions or their attention away from the reality and create this fake threat out there that we know threat tends to increase support for authoritarian leaders.
Yeah, and we have another film in our festival called Influence, and it's very much about capturing that sense of a general population's fears and anxieties, and then manipulating those fears and anxieties to rise to power. And sometimes that's not even in a very covert way. Sometimes it's straight out there, and it's the lies are bold and blatant, and that seems to be an increasingly common method of the Trump camp is that some of the stuff is just clearly untrue. I mean, what is your perspective on truth in politics, if you like, and when can that the falsehoods cross that threshold because it's getting votes?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, like with the Obama administration, a lot of people were claiming that we were in a post-racial America. Unfortunately, the data didn't really support that conclusion, and we know that racial biases were a very strong predictor of support versus opposition to Obama and even his policies. So something like Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, this is a policy that benefits an overwhelming majority of the U.S. population. Yet you see it split perfectly along partisan lines where Republicans are vehemently against it and Democrats are largely in support of it. And you kind of had a similar thing in the Trump administration where we entered into a post-truth era. Kelly Conway coming out there and saying the alternative facts around Trump's inauguration size, the size of the crowd for Trump's inauguration. And this was highlighted in the Unfit documentary. It seems to be very much split along partisan lines, whether or not you believe this alternative fact versus another actual fact. And you're also seeing it with the COVID-19 fiasco unfolding in the US, where the rates of infection are truly startling. Yet you have it split along partisan lines about whether or not people should be wearing masks, socially distancing, all these things that science tells us is critical for preventing the transmission of this disease or this virus. Yet we're clearly split across partisan lines because of it.
Relating to that COVID environment that's there right now, I've seen some footage of Trump saying, "The less we test, the fewer cases there'll be," which is, it's a fallacy, right? Where it doesn't mean that there will be fewer cases; it just means there will be fewer cases to make him look bad. So
yeah.
I mean,
and there was evidence, like in the beginning stages of the COVID-19 crisis, that Trump was solely concerned with numbers. So whether or not to disembark some of the people that were stuck on cruise ships docked outside of U.S. cities, Trump was more concerned about the numbers going up rather than the actual medical issues that were present within the cruise ships and stuff. So it wasn't about like being empathic towards others, which fits into this narcissistic personality a component that the film really touches on. But it was really an affront to his image and the numbers in the U.S. rather than the health crisis.
How long do you think that that's sustainable to disregard actual people and their well-being? I'm sure that there would have been some Republican or some very right-leaning people on those cruise ships who can afford to go away on
Yeah.
holidays. Like how long do you think um, someone can perpetuate bold-faced lies to the detriment of people's well-being before there's a sudden shift?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask the group of political psychologists at the beginning of the Trump administration, we would have drawn that line much, much earlier than we're at the moment. But maybe I'm blindly optimistic, but I think that Trump is about at that point where, I mean, he's just lost so much credibility on so many useless lies that he tells. I mean, I think the Washington Post has him clocked at something like 17,000 lies since taking office. I mean, it's absurd that somebody could tell these many lies and still have public trust behind him. Yet when looking at attitudes towards COVID-19, we are seeing it's less. I think it's less partisan than some of the other issues that Trump has gotten behind, and you're starting to see conservatives voice their opposition to Trump's approach towards containing COVID-19.
What do you think has contributed to the population? He seems to have grown a strong, widespread base. What do you think has contributed to the rise of such nationalism and indeed white nationalism and indeed science denying white nationalism? It seems like a real an unusually disproportionate growth in this population base to his support base compared to other countries. What do you think's given rise to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a constellation of psychological traits within Trump supporters. You have the anti-science, the climate change denier, the anti-vaxxers, all of these things just coalescing in this, to kind of use Clinton's term, into a deplorable group of psychological characteristics that Trump kind of capitalized on. And in some ways, I don't want to give Trump too much support for what he's done. He's like Scaramucci in the documentary said, one of the things that his opponents have really mistakenly done is underestimate Trump's capabilities. The more time goes on, the more it seems like that's not the case. It really seems like there's this incompetent buffoon in the White House who really has no capacity really to lead.
Yeah, and I mean, we were speaking with a couple. You're welcome to bring your daughter or your son on camera as well. We don't want to impede your childcare, but we were just talking with a couple of Americans in Chicago and New York earlier this morning, and yeah, the anxiety about the COVID response there, as the curve flattens, except not in a good way. It's gone back up to the worst scenario. How do you think that there is hope with Biden in terms of the election, or do is there suddenly going to be a shift towards pro science over pro rhetoric? Do you think that there'll be action to stem this tide of COVID infection?
I mean, to a certain extent, I think returning to some form of normalcy is a good thing for the U.S. I mean, regardless of who people were behind for the DNC nomination, I think everyone is pretty much around the idea that there needs to be order and that there needs to be leadership around this. And it seems so simple and so trivial, really. But having the president wear a mask on television, that very, very simple message sends such an important picture and message to the entire population. And I really don't think you can underestimate just how important something like that could be. So it's like he has a COVID-19 task force going out there saying, oh, yeah, you should socially distance, you should wear masks, etc. Yet Trump is holding rallies where he's removing stickers reminding people to socially distance. He's going on stage without a mask. He's using racist terms to refer to COVID-19. I mean, all of these things from a position of authority sets the normative environment within the country, and everything kind of just trickles down from there. So having somebody back in office who at least, I mean, Biden's a pretty moderate dude. He's not going to radically shake things up. Not to the extent that Biden or Warren or some of the others on the left would have done. He's essentially going to go back in and I think hopefully restore some confidence in American institutions. My fear is that Trump has really demonstrated the frailty of the American democracy, and the international global community is going to realize that it takes one crazy election and America's off the boat again, and that's perhaps the most dangerous legacy of Trump.
From an outsider's point of view, observing American politics, is that it always seemed to be a slow shuffle towards the side of the boat, no matter who was in power, and even under Obama, we were talking about the post-racial era. Black Lives Matter actually started under the current form of it was under Obama's administration, because there was an increase. Well, it seemed like an increase of police killing black people in the states, and that preceded Trump. So it's not just like Trump got into power and everything fell apart. There were always external problems. In your opinion, to what degree does it matter if it's Democrat or Republican, left or right, with regards to the figurehead at the top, and what power do those people actually have to affect change?
Well, I guess looking at the current cases that the Supreme Court has heard over the last couple of weeks, there have been like 3 pretty high-profile cases where the Supreme Court has sided more on the left, if you would, in terms of things like abortion rights and issues regarding Trump's attempt to litigate pretty much everything. And I think that does demonstrate kind of the effectiveness of some of the checks and balances in the American system. So I guess the short into your answer is I don't think you're going to see radical change in the US in any time. I think it's going to be a rather slow process of moving things back to the center and away from the right. Because even Trump's election is continuation of polarization trends that started 30 or 40 years ago. So it's not like you were saying, Matthew, it wasn't that Trump got in office and all of a sudden American politics were polarized. This has been going on for 30 or 40 years, and Trump is just the latest person to capitalize on it and do it quite effectively.
What are your thoughts on all of this, Alicia? I'm listening quietly.
Yeah, well, I think that is a good point, that this didn't all start just because Trump got into office. Yeah, that's definitely good to reflect on. Yeah, I don't know what else, I well, for me, when I look at New Zealand, I think about what is the actual foundation, without going into too much, but like looking at the doctrine of Christian discovery, what Captain Cook came over here with, like that is the actual foundation of our country. And the legacies that those people brought here, we still see the effects of that. So yeah, I think it is important to note that this didn't just start with Trump, but like, yeah. That's my calm version of talking about it.
And Danny, what's your impression there? Because often Indigenous politics get left out of the America conversation. Is that
Mhm.
we, as Alicia quite rightly pointed out, is that the parallels of Columbus and Cook arriving on ships bringing disease, instituting a certain economic system which the local people didn't have access to and have been perpetually removed. Always behind the starting line, if you like, when it comes to this system of economic prosperity. What do you think um, is is going on within the states to address that, if anything? Do you think that that's a viable solution to untangle
Yeah,
all of the
because
problems which have coalesced at the top?
my understanding is they came with the same document. It's just that the one that Captain Cook had was a bit of an updated version of that document. But
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main distinctions between New Zealand politics and politics in the U.S. is really just the extent, and this isn't anything to say that the colonizers of New Zealand were particularly benevolent or anything,
yeah,
because there's clear evidence that they weren't. And I think the injustices that we see today against Maori and Indigenous peoples of New Zealand clearly demonstrate that the institutions that were set up on the founding of New Zealand have systematically disadvantaged Maori. I think the difference in the U.S. is the extent to which disease and other such factors wound up essentially annihilating the indigenous peoples of North America. So, looking at the size of the population of the indigenous peoples of the two countries, you know, Native Americans constitute 1% of the U.S. population. And on top of that, they've largely been relegated to the most inhospitable places in the country. So literally shipped off into the desert to basically fend for themselves. Whereas New Zealand, because the population of Maori was so much more numerous and there was resistance amongst the colonization, Maori have had a slightly more influence in politics. And again, not saying that Maori aren't disadvantaged, because they clearly are. We have heaps and heaps of data that continually demonstrate that. But the numerical differences, I think, could potentially explain why we're at different places in the countries at this point.
Sure. And do you think that perhaps more Indigenous participation? I mean, it's more difficult because, as you say, the numbers are, you know, not only were there small numbers to start with, but the effects of that colonization in America totally diminished, decimated populations there. So democracy is really not a favorable thing for an indigenous population in such a situation.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of politicians' viewpoints, are you going to cater to a population that's worth 1% of your vote, or are you going to have a more a message that's more appealing to the broader population? And so I think something like the Waitangi tribunals and having some form of reparation within the U.S. for Native Americans, it's not going to happen. There's not the political movement for that at the moment, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sorry, it sounded like you were about
oh,
to.
I was just gonna say, like, I think it's always good to look back, Like even though things that are happening right now, I think it's always good to look back. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, where we're at today is a result of where we were in the past. And that's why recognizing historical injustices is so important, because, everybody isn't born with the same opportunities. And this idea about colorblind racism, people's belief that, oh, I don't see color, as such, I can't be racist. Well, if people are starting at unequal positions, they're going to end up in unequal places, and we need to recognize that in order to address the systemic racism within society.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a few minutes left, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, Danny, on how you perceive we could make either a better political system or a better political situation, a more fair and just world. I know that's that's a big question, but maybe just starting with the states as well, or reflecting on the environment in the states and how we might apply that to Aotearoa New Zealand as well.
I mean, not to say that the U.S. is a lost cause at this moment, but I think that there's so many different spots that you need to start at with U.S. society to equalize things and make it a more fair and just society. I think some of the movement right now with the Black Lives Matter protests, listening to what minority communities are saying, and it's unfortunate that something like filming a brutal murder of a person can perhaps motivate some change within the system, but it looks like that might be the case in terms of the criminal justice system. That like 60 to 80% of the U.S. population is in support of the nonviolent protests in the states at the moment. I don't think we've seen a reversal since the civil rights movement that's that large. So in that sense, I think there potentially is the opportunity for there to be some reform within the criminal justice system. But the extent to which that spills over into other aspects of systemic racism within American society, change is hard and change takes a long time. Within New Zealand, I think in some ways, it's COVID-19 experience that we've all gone through. In some ways, we almost have the opportunity to set the reset button on things and design society to be a little more equal. Whether or not we're looking at the taxing structure, implementing things like capital gains taxes to prevent the gross inequities that are present in like U.S. society and some other Western European countries. So the fact that the nation has an enormous amount of debt at the moment because of the COVID-19 lockdowns and subsequent economic recession across the globe, we have a real opportunity here to redesign things to be more equitable, I think.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're almost at time. Alicia, have you got any more thoughts or questions on the subject?
Oh, many thoughts. No, but no, I feel like we've had a great conversation, and also a great conversation with you, Danny, over the last few weeks. So yeah, thank you so much for opening our minds and enlightening us.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's really been a pleasure. One of the hardest things about the lockdown for lecturers was not being able to see people. So it's nice being able to talk to somebody other than my camera.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a real pleasure, Danny. And if anybody has any questions and is watching from home, you can email myself or Alicia. Our email addresses are in the chat box there, and we can pass them on to Danny for further discussion, perhaps. But for the moment, we'd really appreciate you coming to join us for the last few weeks. As Alicia said, I'd just like to support that, Danny, and also to Ray Foundation for making this all possible, and Doc Edge for putting on this great opportunity for young people to get more of an insight from experts about what the the future political landscape might look like and what it is, you know, giving some context to what's happening right now. So thank you very much, Danny. Thank you very much, Alicia. We'll catch up soon.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.